Thank you, Ann. Our own Dan Vaughn reminded all of us recently that one of the purposes of ministry is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. Well, this sermon is definitely on the afflict the comfortable side of that spectrum. And I want you to know that such sermons are usually aimed at the most sort of backsliding, sinful, depraved hypocrites in the room. And in this case, and in almost all cases, that group includes me. I do these sermons because they help me refine what my highest values are, but then expressing my struggles with those highest values in such a public forum sort of keeps me honest. I find myself over the next weeks and months, when there's a decision to be made that maybe I've done a sermon that might have something to do with that decision, I find myself asking, what would JD do if he were giving a sermon about this? So it keeps me honest. So I say all that because if what I'm about to say leaves you feeling a little afflicted or a little, squirming in your seat or maybe a little defensive, please just know up front that I am right there with you. This is me struggling with aligning my life with my own highest values. Here we go. When our kids were small, they were typical kids in that they wanted as much candy and sweets as they could get. And we were typical parents in that we weren't going to allow that. We wanted to set a good example of healthy diet and food consumption. And somewhere along the line, one of our kids, or maybe it was me, we weren't sure last night when we were talking about it, somebody had the idea of, just for an experiment, let's one time have candy for dinner. Candy for dinner. Just imagine candy for dinner. We would switch dessert and the main course and the dessert. So we would have candy for dinner and vegetables for dessert. But the usual rules would apply. So take as much as you want, as much as you can eat. You can have seconds if you want, but don't take anything that you don't think you can finish. And you don't get to have dessert until you've finished everything that you took. Okay? Pretty normal rules. Probably many households have similar rules. Well, we got out the family candy jar, and there were some, I think it was carrots and broccoli as the dessert offering, and our kids went nuts. They piled their plates high with the most colorful still life of M&Ms and chocolate bars and Reese's, whatever. It was a childhood fantasy of candy for dinner. And before too long, of course, their stomachs didn't feel very well, and their mouths were just so filled with that sticky sweetness that they were begging for dessert, even though there was no way they were going to finish what was on their plate. And I remember one of our kids actually tearfully begging for a carrot or some broccoli. So I've used that story for many years to sort of illustrate how kids are not very good at considering the consequences of their choices. They don't seem to plan ahead very well, and they'll pile their plates when candy for dinner is what's on the menu. And in more recent years, I've started to realize that I'm not that much better at it. It's just a different sort of equation on a longer time scale. If you ask a homeless person, what would enough look like in your life? How would you define enough? What would make it so that you could say, okay, I'm satisfied, now I have enough? They might say, if I could just have a secure home and a bed to sleep in at night where I'm not constantly being roused by passersby or the police or something, that would do it. That would be enough. Well, if you ask someone who lives in a stable home what enough would look like for them, they might say, if I could just have a reliable car that would get me back and forth to work without the risk and the insecurity of being stranded by the side of the highway, that would do it. That would be enough for me. Well, if you ask a middle-class professional with 2 brand new cars what enough would look like to them, they might say, enough for a secure retirement, enough to know that I'm not going to be destitute sometime before I die. You can see this pattern, right? Can we skip right to the top and ask a billionaire, multi-billionaire, what would enough look like to you? And at least 3 of them have said, going to space would be enough for me. So it's clear to me that, at least for people in our society, maybe for humans in general, we're not good at ever being satisfied. We're not good at defining enough in a way that's durable, that stays the same as our circumstances change. So I find myself asking myself, how would I define enough? And here, by enough, I mean wealth, comfort, and convenience. What is enough wealth? What is enough comfort? What is enough convenience for me personally? And when you start to do this, when you start to try and figure out what would enough look like for me, you very quickly run into the problem of the difference between wants and needs. So when I got to that point, right away in my head, it was like, oh, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I looked it up, and you may have seen this before. It's usually graphically expressed as a pyramid, and the bottom level of needs is physiological needs, just basically meeting your body's needs. Then above that is safety, love and belonging, esteem, and then a little triangle at the top is self-actualization. So I happened to be having a problem, a decision involving a lawnmower. So came to mind was, where does a lawnmower fit on Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Nowhere. I mean, you could stretch and make an argument that there's a safety need somewhere in there, but I'm not buying it. And yet, all of us either have a lawnmower or we pay someone else to use a lawnmower, right? So do we need a lawnmower? Where does a lawnmower fit in our Maslow's hierarchy of needs? When I was about 8 or 10, somewhere in there, my parents made a decision that turned out to be really pivotal in my childhood, but also in my life. And that is that my father left his job as an engineer, a pretty well-paying job as an engineer at Kodak in Rochester, to start a small bulk food business, just a small food store. My parents were also Shackley distributors. It's a multi-level marketing thing. What I'm trying to get at here is that for the next maybe 8 years, money was really tight for our family. It was completely different than what we had experienced before. And when any of the 4 of us kids complained about how we didn't have new shoes or new clothes for the first day of school, or how we just didn't have what other kids seemed to have, one of the answers that my parents would often give is they would respond by saying, we live far more luxurious lifestyles of deep convenience and comfort compared to kings of old. I'm not sure why they said kings of old. That's a weird turn of phrase, but that's the one I remember. And it's true. You only have to go back about 300 years, maybe 400 years, and even the wealthiest, most kowtowed to nobility throughout Europe and the world didn't have anywhere near the comfort and luxury that pretty much all of us take for granted now. When it was hot on a hot summer day, they were just hot. There was no alternative. So compared to not that long ago, we live lives of incredible luxury and convenience and comfort. How would you define enough? And more importantly, what would it take for you to answer that question with, I already have enough. This is enough. Do you know anyone who would authentically answer the question that way? My guess is that there aren't many, and that those people are special in some way. I think that not having a definition of enough is a kind of spiritual depravity. Because if you don't have a definition of enough, you can never be satisfied. And not being able to be satisfied interferes with my ability to live in a state of gratitude. If we don't define enough, we can't share our excesses. We can't share our surpluses with others because there are no excesses. There are never any surpluses because there is never really enough. Not having a definition of enough is spiritual depravity because it distracts us from the sources of true happiness. It puts us on a consumerism treadmill that keeps us away from spending time with our families and from doing other activities that help us meet the higher levels of Maslow's pyramid of needs, like belonging and self-actualization. Things don't help with that. Not having a definition of enough is a spiritual depravity because our comforts and our conveniences have costs. Consumerism, our culture of consumerism, has habituated us, at least for middle-class Americans, to a habit of offloading our discomforts and inconveniences onto others. It's depraved because that requires a certain level of self-deception. In order to remain comfortable, we have to blind ourselves to those costs that we ask others to bear for us. Let me just give you a few examples. When it's really hot in the summertime and my house is filled with the discomfort of heat and humidity, and I switch on the air conditioner, what that machine literally does is it removes heat and humidity from the inside of my house and it puts it outside of my house. It can't just make it cold. The laws of physics say that it has to go somewhere. That heat has to go somewhere. And so the air conditioner puts it outside of my house, where it raises the heat and the humidity for every other creature and person that doesn't have air conditioning outside of my house, including my neighbor who just can't afford it, but also all the wildlife that lives out there. Now, if I lived out in the middle of a forest somewhere with miles of a rural place with not many other people, it would be negligible. But if I live in the suburbs or in the city, me switching on my air conditioner contributes to the heat island effect. It's very measurable, and it literally makes everyone else who doesn't have air conditioning more uncomfortable. They are bearing the cost of my comfort when I switch that thing on. I happen to really enjoy the cordless convenience of having the whole world of information right here in my pocket. And when it comes time for me to get a new phone, I may prefer not to know or not to remember that the cordlessness of this thing requires a battery that requires a certain amount of cobalt. Cobalt, a significant, serious proportion, I think it's about a third of the world cobalt market, comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where UNICEF estimates the mining is done largely by about 40,000 children in extremely hazardous, sometimes lethal conditions. Probably rather not think about that when it comes time to buy a new phone or a new battery for my phone. I like perfect red apples with no spots on them. And as Joni Mitchell sang in the 60s, give me spots on my apples, but leave me the birds and the bees. Well, when I buy those perfect round red apples, I am offloading the spots onto the birds and the bees. Maybe we don't use DDT anymore, but we're still using something, right? Not having a definition of enough security leads us to look the other way while our nation wages drone warfare, in which case I am offloading the dirty work and the moral injury, the PTSD of that work onto my fellow Americans, people who are just trying to serve their country. I could go on and on. Cheap meat, border patrols, all these comforts and conveniences involve me offloading my discomfort and my inconvenience onto others. How can we define enough? Well, I came across one approach earlier this summer. I heard a talk by Chuck Fowler, who is a retired fisheries researcher. And he spent his whole career really taking an in-depth look at the interconnected food web of marine ecosystems. And at some point along the line, he realized that humans are part of that web. We're part of the marine food web. And we occupy a niche, or we should be occupying a niche, that's kind of similar to dolphins and seals and other predators that are near the top of that web. And so he started making these graphs of how much biomass is used by each of the species in that web, especially focusing on the species that are really similar to us. And what he found is that he had to graph these things on logarithmic axes because, for example, dolphins, who eat sort of the same things we do, cod and salmon and some of the same fish that we take from the ocean are also dolphin food. And what he found is that we are using 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 times as much as dolphins and or seals do. So one approach to enough, at least on a global scale, would be to ask ourselves, what do similar predators consume? And that would give us sort of a guideline for how much we could be consuming if we were in a sustainable food web instead of just like broadly taking everything as we are now. So we are broadly taking everything because we don't have a definition of enough. And now we are facing the consequences. Our cravings are infinite, but the earth is finite. And I play a role in that, as the Reverend said in the reading that Ann read. And I can't blame big business. It's easy to point my finger and say, big business has to take care of this. But they're doing this because I pay them to do it. I can't just abdicate my responsibility as a consumer for paying big business to do my dirty work. So again, how do I define enough? Well, it's not easy given that I'm bombarded with advertising 24/7 along with that global information source. The internet is almost exclusively funded by advertising. And these people know human psychology. They're scientists. They know what motivates us, and they make use of that. Doesn't make it easy to define enough. And with big data, now they're able to actually get pretty specific. They know what motivates J.D. Stillwater, and they can make use of that. They can tap into that. I saw an ad on the internet recently that was just really blatant, just big block letters that said, "You deserve a new phone." And the first time I saw it, I was like, but I like my phone. What is this deserve stuff? You don't even know me. But, after you see the same ad for a few times, it's like, oh, those new phones do look pretty snazzy. Maybe, it works. It really works. So, how do we define enough? How do we even begin? We live in a society that encourages us to have candy for dinner 24/7, 365. And it is killing us. How much comfort and convenience is enough? What will it take for each of us, for me specifically, to be okay with more broccoli and spinach in my consuming? Or as Jimmy Carter asked us decades ago, what will it take to just turn down the thermostat and put on a sweater? Jimmy Carter's about to turn 97 on October 1. What a guy. I'm told that every good sermon has an action step, something that people can just take home and run with and, maybe make a difference in your life. So here it comes. I'm asking several things of you. The first is, set about trying to define enough for yourself. You don't have to come up with an answer. Just try to define it and see where it leads you. And try to seek a process or an answer that is durable, something that will still be true if you win the lottery or get a major promotion. Ask yourself, what discomforts have I been offloading onto others or onto the earth that I could take back and carry for my own self as a strong and spiritually mature adult? Think about it over the next few days or weeks and send me what you come up with. Or better yet, post them on the church's Facebook page. Let's start a conversation there about what enough looks like for each of us. And it's fine if they're all completely different, but the conversation itself may lead to something profound, something that really does change our lives in some significant way that allows us to feel more satisfied, more grateful, more part of a community. Thank you for letting me share this morning. Namaste.